what turns a town joke into a legend. In the dust-choked plains of the West, a man with nothing to his name but a good heart becomes the town's biggest fool. He takes in a woman left for dead, her 2 newborn sons clinging to life beside her. The townsfolk of Redemption Gulch laugh. They mock his poverty and his bleeding heart foolishness. But they don't know the secret the woman carries or the brutal danger that follows in her wake. They laughed at Cole Thornton for trying to save a ghost, until the day that ghosts past came to burn their whole world down. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Montana Territory, beating the cracked earth into a state of perpetual submission. For Cole Thornton, the heat was just another unpaid bill, another hardship to be endured. His horse, a weary roan named Patches, plodded along the barely there trail, each step a small protest. Cole's pockets were as empty as the landscape around him, filled with nothing but lint and the faint, bitter taste of failure. Another week, another rancher telling him they weren't hiring. He was a good hand, honest and tireless, but in a land choking on drought, men like him were as common and as worthless as dust. He was heading back to his squatter's shack, a generous term for the leaning collection of weathered planks and hope that overlooked the smug little town of Redemption Gulch. It was there, with the sun beginning its slow, bloody descent behind the jagged peaks, that he heard it. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the whistle of the wind through the sagebrush. It was a sound so foreign, so fragile, in that vast, brutal expanse that he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. A thin, reedy wail. The sound of a kitten, perhaps. He pulled Patches to a halt, his own exhaustion forgotten, and listened. The wind swirled, carrying the sound away, then brought it back more insistent this time. He dismounted his worn boots, sinking into the dust, and tethered Patches to a gnarled juniper tree. He followed the sound, his hand resting instinctively on the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. The cries led him off the trail towards a shallow rocky arroyo carved out by flash floods that seemed a distant memory in the current drought. And then he saw her. She was crumpled at the base of a sun-bleached boulder, a discarded doll of a woman with hair the color of spun corn silk, now matted with dirt and blood. Her dress, once likely a fine calico, was torn and stained, offering little protection from the elements. Her face was a canvas of suffering, bruised, swollen, and impossibly pale beneath a layer of grime. Flies buzzed lazily around a gash on her forehead. He thought she was dead. Then a weak moan escaped her cracked lips, and the source of the crying became terrifyingly clear. Tucked into the folds of her skirt, nestled against the faint warmth of her body, were 2 impossibly small bundles. Newborns. Their faces were red and wrinkled, their tiny fists balled in a desperate, silent protest against the world they'd been born into. One of them let out another of those heart-wrenching wails. Cole felt the air leave his lungs. He had seen death in many forms in bar fights, on cattle drives, in the grim aftermath of skirmishes with bandits. But this was a different kind of horror. This was a quiet, deliberate cruelty. Someone had not just abandoned this woman. They had left her and her children to be baked by the sun, picked apart by scavengers, and erased by the uncaring wilderness. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest. He touched the woman's neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter, as fragile as a moth's wing. Her life was a guttering candle flame, and the slightest breeze would extinguish it. The babies, miraculously, seemed more robust. Their cries a testament to a primal will to live. Cole was a practical man, because poverty demanded it. His mind immediately catalogued the impossibilities. His shack was a single room with a leaky roof and a dirt floor. He had a half-full sack of flour, some beans, and a little coffee. He had no cradle, no milk, no medicine. Taking them in was an act of lunacy. It was inviting 3 more mouths to starve alongside his own. The logical thing to do was to ride into Redemption Gulch and fetch the sheriff, let the town handle it. But he knew Redemption Gulch. He knew Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was as malleable as warm wax. He knew the town council led by the pompous cattle baron Bartholomew Bart Higgins, who saw charity as a personal failing. They would see a vagrant woman and her bastard children. They'd send her on the next wagon out of the territory. Or worse, leave her to the dubious mercy of the overworked and underfunded territorial asylum. They wouldn't see a human being. They would see a problem. Cole looked at the mother's face at the dried tear tracks that cut clean lines through the dirt on her cheeks. He looked at the tiny, helpless infants. His own mother had died when he was a boy, and he'd spent years drifting, defined by what he lacked. He had nothing. But in that moment, standing over this tableau of human suffering, he knew that leaving them was the one act of poverty his soul could not afford. With a groan, he gently disentangled the babies. They were wrapped in scraps of a fine linen shirt, a man's shirt now soiled. They were impossibly light. He tucked one inside his own dusty shirt, the tiny body a shocking, immediate warmth against his skin. He held the other securely in the crook of his arm. Then, with a strength born of pure resolve, he bent down and carefully lifted the woman. She was lighter than she should have been, a collection of sharp angles and brittle bones. She moaned again, a sound of pure agony, but did not wake. He carried his broken family back to his horse. Patches, bless his stoic heart, didn't spook. He merely watched with wide, intelligent eyes as Cole painstakingly situated the woman in the saddle, leaning her forward against the horn. He then mounted behind her, the baby still in his arm, the other still nestled against his chest. It was awkward, dangerous, and the slowest he had ever ridden. Every step Patches took seemed to send a fresh wave of pain through the woman. The sun finally vanished, and the chill of the desert night began to creep in. The baby in his arm began to cry, a thin, hungry sound that soared at his nerves. As the first faint lights of Redemption Gulch appeared in the distance, a hard knot of dread formed in Cole's stomach. He wasn't just riding towards his shack. He was riding towards ridicule, towards scorn, towards a fight he had no earthly idea how to win. He was a broke cowboy carrying a dying woman and 2 wailing infants. It was the stuff of a tragic, farcical song, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the whole town was about to start laughing. Cole's shack was even more pitiful than he remembered. In the pale moonlight, the gaps in the walls seemed wider, the lean-to roof more precarious. He managed to get the woman inside and onto his own cot, which was little more than a burlap sack stuffed with straw laid over a crude wooden frame. She sank into it without a sound, her breathing shallow and ragged. The babies were the immediate crisis. They were crying in earnest now, a duet of desperate hunger. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Cole's exhaustion. He had no idea what to do. He'd wrestled steers and broken wild stallions, but he'd never held a baby for more than a fleeting moment. He laid them gently on his only blanket near the cold hearth. He fumbled to light his lantern, the flickering yellow light casting long, dancing shadows that made the small space feel haunted. He needed milk. He needed medicine. He needed help. Leaving the woman and babies alone was a risk, but leaving them without sustenance was a certainty of death. Gritting his teeth, he strode out into the night and made his way down the hill into the sleeping town of Redemption Gulch. The only light came from the saloon, but his first stop was the general store. He banged on the door, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet street. After a long moment, a window creaked open on the second floor, and a head wrapped in a nightcap poked out. It was Bertha May Wiggins, the store's proprietor, and the town's primary distributor of gossip. "Who in tarnation is that?" she squawked, her voice like a rusty hinge. "It's Cole Thornton, ma'am. I need your help. It's an emergency." An emergency? She sniffed, her skepticism traveling down through the dark. What kind of emergency requires a man to wake a decent woman from her sleep? "Your shack fall over again?" "No, ma'am. I found a woman out on the trail. She's hurt bad. And she's got babies. Newborns. They're starving. I need milk. Canned milk, goat's milk, anything you've got." There was a long pause from the window above. Cole could practically hear the gears of gossip grinding in Bertha May's head. A strange woman. Babies. Cole Thornton. It was a scandal stew, and she had the first ladle. Babies. She finally said, her tone shifting from irritation to a sharp, predatory curiosity. "Where'd she get babies from, ma'am?" "I don't know. She was left for dead. Please. I can't pay you right now, but I'll work it off. I swear on my father's grave." "Your credit is as thin as bathwater, Cole Thornton," she clucked. But the lure of the story was too strong. "Fine. Stop your caterwauling. I'm coming down." Minutes later, the door unbolted, and Bertha May stood there in her nightgown and robe, holding a lantern that illuminated the suspicious squint in her eyes. She sold him 2 cans of condensed milk and an old glass bottle with a rubber nipple she found in a dusty box, all at a price that would have been extortionate in broad daylight. "You bring a harlot and her spawn into the shadow of this town. Cole Thornton, you'll bring trouble with her. Mark my words," she warned, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of sanctimony and excitement. His next stop was the doctor's office. He pounded on that door too, until a weary-looking Doc Peterson answered, smelling of whiskey and sleep. Cole explained the situation again, his words tumbling out in a rush of desperation. The doctor was a man worn down by apathy and alcohol, but the mention of newborns sparked a flicker of his old professional duty. All right, hold your horses," he grumbled, grabbing his worn leather bag. "Probably just some drifter's brat. Don't expect a miracle." When they returned to the shack, the scene was grim. The woman hadn't moved. The baby's cries had weakened into pathetic, gasping whimpers. Doc Peterson took one look at the mother and grunted. "She's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and has a nasty concussion. That gash on her head is infected. I'll clean it, but she needs broth water and rest. If she doesn't wake in a day or 2. Well, he left the grim conclusion hanging in the air. He examined the twins, his movements surprisingly gentle. They're small, but they seem healthy enough, all things considered. It's a miracle they've lasted this long. He showed Cole how to mix the condensed milk with boiled water and how to carefully feed the babies with the bottle. It was a clumsy, frustrating process. The babies choked and spluttered, more milk seeming to end up on the blanket than in their mouths. But slowly, painstakingly, they began to drink. Their cries subsided, replaced by tiny, contented gurgles. The relief that washed over Cole was so profound it almost brought him to his knees. Doc Peterson stitched the woman's forehead with a practiced hand. I'll leave you some laudanum for her pain if she wakes, and some carbolic powder for the wound. That's all I can do. The rest is up to God and you, son, and I suspect God's got other things on his mind." He looked around the squalid shack at the broke cowboy and the broken family he'd adopted. "You've taken on a hell of a burden, Thornton." By morning, the story was all over Redemption Gulch. Bertha May had made sure of that. As Cole walked into town to try and find some odd jobs to pay for the milk, the whispers followed him like flies. "There he is. The orphan collector," someone hissed from an alley. From the porch of the saloon, Bart Higgins. The cattle baron laughed, a booming sound that carried across the street. Higgins was a big man with a florid face and a sense of self-importance that radiated from him like heat. He saw Cole's poverty as a moral stain. "Hey, Thornton," he bellowed, gesturing with his cigar. A group of his ranch hands snickered alongside him. "Heard you've gone and adopted a whole litter. Can't even feed yourself, and now you're playing nursemaid to some saloon girl's mistakes. What's the matter, your heart bigger than your brain?" The men roared with laughter. Cole's face burned with shame and anger. He kept his head down and walked on his fists clenched at his sides. He went to the blacksmith, the livery, the freight office. The answer was the same everywhere: a shake of the head, a smirk, and a refusal. Bart Higgins's opinion carried weight, and no one wanted to be seen helping the town fool. The days that followed blurred into a grueling cycle of survival. The woman remained unconscious, a silent, breathing effigy of suffering. Cole learned to care for the babies with a tender patience he never knew he possessed. He learned the rhythm of their hunger, the meaning of their different cries. He named them in his own mind, just for himself. The quieter one was William, and the noisier one was Thomas. He spent hours boiling water, washing the few rags he had, and feeding them drop by precious drop. He sold his father's pocket watch, his last sentimental possession, for a pittance to buy more milk and some potatoes. The laughter of the town was a constant backdrop to his struggle. He became a ghost in his own community, an object of derision and pity. Children would sometimes follow him at a distance, chanting, "Cole, Cole, the baby's fool lives in a shack and eats gruel." He was isolated, exhausted, and poorer than he had ever been. At night he'd sit by the hearth, watching the 3 souls who now depended on him entirely. He'd look at the woman's still pale face and wonder who she was. What monster had done this to her? He'd look at the sleeping infants and feel a fierce, protective love that defied all logic. The town laughed. Let them laugh. Their scorn was a small price to pay for the 2 tiny heartbeats that now filled the silence of his lonely life. He didn't know it yet, but the woman on the cot held a secret that would shatter the smug complacency of redemption. Gulch and the laughter would soon die in their throats, replaced by the cold, sharp tang of fear. 2 weeks crawled by each day, a small victory against the ever-present spectre of starvation and sickness. The woman whom Cole had begun to think of simply as the Madonna of the Arroyo remained lost in the twilight country between life and death. He trickled water and thin broth between her lips, cleaned her wound, and waited. The infection in her head wound receded, a testament more to her own resilience than to Doc Peterson's cursory care. The twins William and Thomas were another story. Under Cole's clumsy but devoted care, they were beginning to thrive. They were still impossibly small, but their cheeks were filling out, their cries growing stronger. They were a constant, demanding presence. Cole's life had shrunk to the 4 walls of his shack, his world measured in feeding times and clean rags. He'd become adept at rocking one baby with his foot, while feeding the other his hands, once calloused from reins and ropes, now surprisingly gentle. The town's ridicule had solidified into a permanent fixture of his existence. Bart Higgins made a point of mocking him whenever he saw him. Bertha May kept a running and largely fictional tally of his supposed dalliances with the fallen woman. Cole learned to ignore it. His focus narrowed to the 3 lives in his charge. He'd managed to find a few days' work mending fences for a small homesteader on the far side of the county, a man who hadn't yet been poisoned by the town's gossip. The pay was meager, but it bought more milk and a small bag of cornmeal. The change came on a quiet afternoon. The sun streamed through the single grimy window of the shack, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Cole was gently washing the woman's face with a damp cloth when her eyelids fluttered. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Her eyes opened. They were a deep, startling blue, the color of a mountain lake, but they were clouded with confusion and fear. She stared at the rough-hewn ceiling of the shack, then at her own hands lying on the blanket. Her gaze darted around the room before finally landing on Cole. A small, terrified sound escaped her throat. "It's all right," Cole said softly, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe. You're safe now." She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. He quickly brought her a cup of water, lifting her head gently so she could drink. She sipped greedily, her eyes never leaving his face. "Where?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "My home. Near Redemption Gulch. I found you in the arroyo." You were hurt." Her eyes widened, and a flicker of memory, sharp and terrible, crossed her face. Her hand flew to her stomach, a gesture of primal, panicked loss. The babies, she gasped, trying to sit up. "My babies." "They're here," Cole said quickly, trying to soothe her. "They're safe. They're right here." He carefully lifted the sleeping twins from their makeshift bed on the floor and brought them to her. Her. She stared at them, her breath catching in a sob. Tears streamed down her face as she reached out a trembling hand to touch Thomas's soft cheek. The raw, overwhelming love in her expression was a thing of pure, devastating beauty. "Thank you," she wept, her gaze shifting back to Cole, a universe of gratitude in her blue eyes. "You saved them. You saved us." Over the next few days, she began to talk. Her name was Rosalind. She spoke in fragments, her memory still a shattered mirror. She didn't know how she had ended up in the arroyo. She remembered blinding pain, the dust, the terror. But the events leading up to it were a blank shrouded in fog. She was weak, but her will was forged from steel. She insisted on helping her fine, delicate hands, learning to fold rags and test the temperature of the milk. She'd hum a soft, haunting lullaby to the boys, a tune that spoke of a life far removed from the dirt floor of a squatter's shack. It was while she was mending a tear in her own tattered dress that she found it. Tucked into a hidden seam in her petticoat was a small, heavy object. With trembling fingers, she pulled it free. It was a locket. It was not the simple tin or brass jewelry a poor woman might own. This was heavy gold, intricately carved with interlocking roses and vines. A small, perfectly cut sapphire winked at its center. Cole stared at it. He'd seen wealth before in the hands of land barons and railroad men. He knew quality when he saw it. That locket was worth more than his shack, his horse, and everything he'd ever owned combined. "Rosalind," he said, slowly, his voice low. "Who are you?" She clutched the locket, her knuckles white. "My mother gave this to me," she whispered. It was her mother's before her. She worked the clasp with a practiced touch. It sprang open. Inside were two miniature, exquisitely painted portraits. One was of a stern-looking woman with Rosalind's blue eyes. The other was of a handsome, dark-haired man, with a cruel twist to his lips. At the sight of the man's face, Rosalind flinched as if struck. The fog in her memory seemed to part, and a storm of raw terror broke across her features. Radcliffe, she breathed the name, a curse on her lips. Sterling Radcliffe. The story came tumbling out, then a torrent of fear and betrayal. Her full name was Rosalind Ainsworth. Her family was one of the wealthiest in St. Louis, their fortune built on shipping and banking. She was an only child, the sole heiress to the Ainsworth fortune. Sterling Radcliffe was her cousin, a man consumed by greed and envy. Her parents had died in a riverboat accident, the year before an accident she now suspected Radcliffe had arranged. As her legal guardian, he had taken control of the estate. He had tried to force her into a marriage with one of his business cronies, a man who would give him access to her inheritance. Rosaline had refused. She had a secret of her own. For years she had been in love with a young architect, a man of talent and ambition, but no fortune. When she discovered she was pregnant, they had made plans to elope to escape to California and start a new life. But Radcliffe had found out. He told me no child of mine would ever inherit the Ainsworth name. She said, her voice shaking with remembered horror. He said he would wipe the stain of my mistake from the family ledger. Radcliffe had hired men. They'd taken her from her bed one night, dragged her and her lover into the wilderness. They murdered her beloved before her eyes. They beat her, took her west on a wagon, and when she went into a premature and agonizing labor, they left her and her newborn sons to die in the desolate plains of Montana, assuming the wilderness would erase their crime completely. Cole listened, his blood running cold. This was not a saloon girl. This was an heiress, a woman of means and standing. And her babies, William and Thomas, were not bastards born of a fleeting dalliance. They were the rightful heirs to a fortune and the target of a man who had already proven he was capable of murder. He looked from the priceless locket to the sleeping infants. The scorn of Redemption Gulch suddenly seemed like a childish game. He had not just taken in a stray. He had stumbled into a war. He had sheltered the survivors of an attempted assassination, and their enemy was a man with the wealth and power to burn the whole world down to find them. The laughter from the town had not stopped, but Cole was no longer listening. He was listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats, for the arrival of a shadow that was far more dangerous than the derision of fools like Bart Higgins. He had thought his fight was against poverty. He now knew his real enemy was a man named Sterling Radcliffe, and the fight was for life itself. The revelation of Rosalind's identity changed everything. The meager shack no longer felt like a simple refuge from poverty. It felt like a fragile fortress besieged by an unseen enemy. Every gust of wind, every distant coyote howl sent a jolt of anxiety through Cole. He began carrying his Colt peacemaker from sunup to sundown. Rosalind, for her part, seemed to grow stronger with the telling of her story. The fear was still there, a constant shadow in her eyes, but it was now tempered with a fierce protective resolve. She was no longer just a victim. She was a mother guarding her sons. Her focus on William and Thomas was absolute. Their survival was her sole purpose, an act of defiance against the man who had tried to erase them. Cole knew they couldn't stay. Sooner or later, Radcliffe would discover that the Montana wilderness had failed to do his bidding. A man that meticulous, that ruthless, would not leave such a loose end untied. He would send people looking. The problem was they had nowhere to go. Rosalind was still too weak for a long journey, and the babies were too vulnerable. And Cole had no money to fund an escape. He doubled his efforts to find work, taking on the most grueling, low-paying jobs on the fringes of the county. He dug ditches, mucked out stables, and repaired fences until his hands were raw and his back screamed in protest. Every penny was sacred, saved for the day they could buy a wagon and supplies and disappear into the vastness of the West. The town, oblivious to the storm gathering on the horizon, continued its campaign of petty cruelty. Bart Higgins, seeing Cole working like a dog for scraps, grew even more arrogant. Look at him. Higgins would boom from the saloon porch to his sycophants. Thornton so desperate he's working for chicken feed all to keep his little charity house running. A man's got to have pride. One afternoon, as Cole was loading supplies onto a freight wagon, Higgins confronted him directly. "Thornton," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I'm a generous man. I'll give you $100 cash money right now, enough to get you a fresh start somewhere else. All you have to do is turn that woman and her brats over to the territorial marshal. Let the authorities handle her kind." Cole paused, his muscles aching. He looked at Higgins's fleshy, self-satisfied face. "She's not a kind of woman, Higgins. She's a human being. And she's under my protection." Higgins's face purpled. "Protection? You can't even protect yourself from a strong wind. You're a fool, Thornton. A pathetic, penniless fool." Cole simply turned and went back to his work, but the encounter left him shaken. Higgins's offer, insulting as it was, highlighted his own powerlessness. The first sign of real trouble arrived not as a posse of gunmen, but as a single, well-dressed man on a fine black horse. He rode into Redemption Gulch one dusty morning and tied his horse outside the saloon. He was clean-shaven, wore a city suit, and had the cold, observant eyes of a predator. He didn't look like a cowboy or a prospector. He looked like money, and he looked like trouble. The man's name was Fletcher. He started his inquiries in the place where all information in Redemption Gulch was traded Bertha May's general store. Cole was in the store at the time, spending a hard-earned dollar on cornmeal when Fletcher walked in. The bell above the door jingled, and the atmosphere in the store shifted. Fletcher tipped his hat to Bertha May. "Ma'am, I'm looking for some information. I'm a private agent working for a prominent family back east. I'm searching for a young woman who may have passed through this area a month or so back." Fair-haired, blue eyes, she would have been in a delicate condition. Bertha May's eyes lit up like lanterns. This was the most exciting thing to happen all year. She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well now, that is interesting. We did have a bit of a situation like that. Our town fool Cole Thornton dragged some half-dead woman out of the desert. Had 2 babies with her, she did." Cole's blood turned to ice. He kept his back to the man, praying Fletcher wouldn't notice him. Fletcher's voice remained calm, but a new sharpness entered it. "Is that so? And where might I find this Mr. Thornton? Lives in a shack up on the hill overlooking town," Bertha May said, eagerly pointing a bony finger. "Can't miss it. It's the one that looks like a strong sneeze could knock it over." Fletcher placed a silver dollar on the counter. "Thank you for your time, ma'am." He turned, his cold eyes sweeping the store, and for a heart-stopping second, they met Cole's. There was no recognition, but the intensity of the man's gaze made the hair on Cole's arms stand up. As soon as Fletcher left, Cole abandoned his cornmeal and bolted out the back door. He scrambled up the hill to his shack, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm of terror. "He's here!" he gasped as he burst through the door. "A man? He's asking about you." Rosalind's face went white as a sheet. She instinctively gathered the twins closer to her. "Fletcher," she whispered, and the name confirmed Cole's worst fears. She knew him. He was one of Radcliffe's men. She explained, her voice trembling. A fixer, he handled difficult business. There was no time to run, no time to hide. The shack was a trap. Cole grabbed his Colt and checked the cylinder. 6 bullets. It felt like nothing against the encroaching darkness. Minutes later, the sound of a horse approaching sent a fresh wave of panic through them. Cole positioned himself by the door out of sight, his gun held tight in his sweating palm. Rosalind huddled on the cot with the babies, trying to quiet their whimpers. A sharp knock came at the door. "Mr. Thornton." "My name is Fletcher. I'd like a word with you." Cole remained silent. "I know you're in there." Thornton Fletcher's voice was smooth, reasonable. "The whole town knows about your little charity case. I have a proposition for you. My employer is a very wealthy man. He's willing to pay handsomely for the return of what belongs to him." "She doesn't belong to anyone." Cole called out, his voice steadier than he felt. A sigh from outside the door. "Let's not be difficult. I am authorized to offer you $500, a fortune for a man in your position, enough to buy a small ranch, start a real life. Just open the door and hand over the woman and the children. $500. It was a staggering sum. It was a way out of his miserable existence. For a fleeting second, the temptation was a physical thing, a sweet poison. He looked at Rosalind, her face a mask of terror as she clutched her sons. He thought of the laughter, the scorn, the grinding poverty. Then he thought of the evil that would leave a woman and her babies to die in the dirt. "You go to hell," Cole said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised him. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. "A poor choice," Mr. Thornton Fletcher said, his voice losing all its manufactured pleasantness. It was now flat and cold as a tombstone. "A very poor choice indeed." Cole heard the crunch of boots as Fletcher walked away, the sound of his horse riding off. But he knew this wasn't the end. It was the opening salvo. Fletcher hadn't come for a negotiation. He had come for confirmation. He had found them. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. But the beauty was lost on Cole. The coming night promised not rest but terror. Fletcher would be back, and he wouldn't be alone. The broke cowboy and the runaway heiress were out of time. The shadow of St. Louis had fallen over Redemption Gulch, and a reckoning was coming. The night was a taut, humming wire of dread. Cole didn't dare light a lantern, plunging the shack into a darkness broken only by slivers of moonlight piercing the walls. Every creak of the wood, every rustle in the brush outside was magnified into a looming threat. He sat on a crate by the door, his Colt resting on his knee, while Rosalind tried to soothe the restless babies in the corner. The silence was a conversation of shared terror. Cole knew they couldn't win a direct fight. Fletcher was a professional, and he would come with hired guns. The shack was little more than a tinderbox, offering no real protection. His only hope was that Fletcher would wait until dawn, underestimating the resolve of a penniless fool. It was a vain hope. Around midnight, a flicker of movement at the bottom of the hill caught Cole's eye. 3 riders, dark shapes moving slowly against the pale landscape. They dismounted and began to make their way up the hill on foot, spreading out to approach the shack from different angles. It was Fletcher and 2 others, rough-looking men armed with rifles. Cole's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. "Stay down," he whispered to Rosalind, "and keep the boys quiet, no matter what." He pressed himself against the wall, peering through a crack in the planks. The men were moving with practiced efficiency, closing in. He was outmanned, outgunned, and trapped. Then something unexpected happened. A light bloomed in the town below. A single lantern held aloft, moving purposefully up the hill from the direction of the doctor's house. Doc Peterson, his bag in one hand and the lantern in the other, was trudging up the path. Fletcher and his men froze, melting back into the shadows. The doctor reached the shack and knocked softly. "Cole. You in there?" Cole, wary of a trick, hesitated. "Doc. What are you doing here?" "Bertha, May's got a conscience the size of a mustard seed." "But it pricked her tonight," the doctor said, his voice low. "She saw that city fella Fletcher meeting with a couple of hard cases down by the livery. Paid them in gold. She got scared. Figured whatever he was planning, it wasn't social. I came to check on my patient. It was a flimsy excuse, but the truth of it was clear. The town's apathy was beginning to crack. Doc Peterson, a man who had long since drowned his Hippocratic oath in whiskey, had chosen to walk up a dark hill towards hired guns. Cole risked opening the door a crack. "You need to leave, Doc. It's not safe." "Probably not." Peterson grunted, stepping inside. He glanced at Rosalind and the babies, then at the colt in Cole's hand. "Looks like I'm a little late for a house call." Fletcher, his plan for a quiet, brutal resolution interrupted, changed tactics. Thornton, his voice cut through the night, closer now. "You have one last chance. Send out the woman. No one else has to get hurt. The good doctor can walk away clean." "She's a mother, you son of a bitch," Doc Peterson yelled back, his voice filled with a sudden surprising fury. "With 2 newborn sons. Whatever you are, whatever you're paid, you can't be a party to this." One of Fletcher's men answered with a gunshot. The bullet ripped through the thin wall of the shack, splintering wood just inches from the doctor's head. The babies, startled, began to cry. And that was the moment everything changed. That gunshot was not just an attack on the shack. It was an attack on the town's doctor. It was an act of outside aggression that shattered the bubble of Redemption Gulch's internal squabbles. Down below, lights began to appear in windows. Doors creaked open. The first to react was not a brave soul, but a curious one. Bertha May, peering from her window, saw the muzzle flash on the hill. She let out a shriek that could curdle milk. The second reaction was more significant. Bart Higgins, woken by the shot and the ensuing commotion, stepped onto the porch of his large 2-story house. He'd spent weeks mocking Cole Thornton. He'd built his social standing on the idea that men like Cole were weak, their problems, their own fault. But looking up at that dark hill, at the besieged shack that held a man, he'd ridiculed a doctor, a woman, and 2 crying babies. Something shifted in his chest. This wasn't about poverty anymore. This was about invaders threatening his town. "What in God's name is going on up there?" he bellowed, his powerful voice carrying through the night. "Go back to your homes," Fletcher shouted down. "This is private business." "The hell it is," another voice yelled. It was the blacksmith holding a heavy hammer. "You're shooting at the dock." Men began to emerge from their houses, not with the intention of being heroes, but with the grim territorial anger of homeowners facing a threat. They had rifles meant for hunting coyotes, not men, but they were determined. Fletcher, seeing his quiet operation spiraling into a town-wide confrontation, made a desperate decision. "Burn them out," he ordered his men. One of the thugs ran forward, a lit torch in his hand. He hurled it onto the dry, tinder-like roof of Cole's shack. The roof caught instantly, flames licking up into the night sky. Smoke began to pour into the single room. Rosalind screamed, shielding the coughing babies. This was the final catalyst. The sight of the burning shack, a clear attempt at murder, galvanized the townsfolk. It was one thing to laugh at a fool. It was another thing entirely to watch him and his charges be burned alive. Bart Higgins let out a roar of pure rage. "You bastards! This is our town!" He disappeared into his house and emerged a moment later with a heavy buffalo gun. He might be a pompous blowhard, but he could shoot. He leveled the rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot boomed across the valley, and one of the thugs cried out, clutching his arm as his rifle clattered to the ground. Cole knew it was now or never. "Get the babies out the back," he yelled to Doc Peterson. While the doctor scrambled to get Rosalind and the twins out a small opening in the rear wall, Cole kicked open the front door and charged out, firing his Colt at Fletcher. The night exploded into chaos. Gunshots echoed from the town below as more men joined the fight, firing up at the attackers. Fletcher and his remaining man were caught between Cole's desperate charge and the unexpected furious resistance from the town. They were no longer hunters. They were prey. Cole fired his last shot just as Fletcher leveled his pistol. He saw the flash, felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his shoulder, and stumbled to his knees. But Fletcher staggered back, a dark stain blossoming on his chest, before collapsing into the dust. The last thug, seeing his boss fall, and the entire town seemingly rising against him, threw down his rifle and fled into the darkness. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the burning shack and the crying of the babies. Cole lay in the dirt, his shoulder on fire, the world swimming around him. Townsmen, led by a panting Bart Higgins, swarmed up the hill. They weren't laughing now. Their faces were grim, awestruck. They stared at the dead man, at the wounded thug, and at Cole the broke cowboy, who had faced down hired killers. Doc Peterson was already at Cole's side, pressing a cloth to the wound. "You damned fool," he said, but his voice was thick with respect. "You damned glorious fool." Rosalind rushed to him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Cole, you're hurt." Through the pain, Cole looked past her at the faces of the men of Redemption Gulch. He saw Bart Higgins looking down at him, his usual arrogance replaced by a look of stunned disbelief and something that might have been shame. He saw the blacksmith, the store owners, the ranch hands, all the men who had mocked him. They weren't laughing anymore. The joke was over. In the light of the dying flames of his home, Cole Thornton, the town fool, had become their unwilling hero. The fire consumed what little Cole had owned, reducing the shack to a pile of smoldering ash and blackened timber. But as the sun rose, casting a clean, hopeful light over the valley, it was clear that something new had been forged in the flames' respect. The town of Redemption Gulch awoke with a collective hangover of shock and guilt. The story of the gunfight spread faster than a prairie fire. The dead man was confirmed to be a hired gun from St. Louis. The wounded thug in the custody of a newly assertive Sheriff Brody confessed everything: the identity of his employer, Sterling Radcliffe, and the brutal plot to eliminate Rosalind and her heirs. Cole was carried to Doc Peterson's office, which was quickly filled with well-wishers and the curious. The same people who had jeered him in the street now spoke his name in hushed, reverent tones. Bertha May arrived with a basket filled with fresh bread, cheese, and a jar of her best preserves, her sharp features softened by a genuine concern that was utterly foreign to her. We misjudged you, Cole," she said, avoiding his eyes. "A town needs to look after its own." The most surprising visitor was Bart Higgins. The cattle baron stood awkwardly in the doorway, his large frame seeming to shrink in the small room. He held his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. "Thornton," he began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "I was wrong. What you did, protecting that woman and her children, that was the act of a man with more pride and substance than anyone in this town, myself included." He cleared his throat, his face flushed. "My west pasture borders the creek. It's a prime piece of land. I want you to have it. 10 acres. Consider it an apology." Cole, his shoulder bandaged and his arm in a sling, was stunned into silence. 10 acres of prime land was a fortune. It was a life. Rosalind, who had been sitting by his side, spoke up, her voice clear and strong. "Thank you, Mr. Higgins. That is a most generous offer." Her poise and articulate speech, so at odds with the image of the vagrant they had all held, only deepened their awe. News of the events in Redemption Gulch traveled by telegraph. The story of a small Montana town repelling a gang of killers hired by a wealthy St. Louis industrialist was sensational. More importantly, the confession of Radcliffe's hired man gave the authorities in Missouri everything they needed. Sterling Radcliffe was arrested, his empire of greed and cruelty crumbling under the weight of his own monstrous actions. The law, slow but inexorable, would see him pay for his crimes. The Ainsworth family lawyers soon arrived in Redemption Gulch. They were prepared to whisk Rosalind and the twins back to the glittering society of St. Louis to restore her to her rightful place as the head of a vast fortune. The town held its breath, assuming their brief dramatic connection to the wider world was over. They assumed Rosalind would leave this dusty provincial town and the broke cowboy who had saved her, and they couldn't blame her if she did. But Rosalind had been changed by the fire, too. She had seen the worst of men in Sterling Radcliffe, but she had seen the best of men in Cole Thornton. She had experienced the cold cruelty of wealth and power, and the simple, profound courage of a man with nothing. She met with the lawyers in the town's only hotel. Cole, his arm still in a sling, waited on the porch outside, convinced his part in her story was over. He had saved her, and now she would return to her world, and he to his. After an hour, she emerged, her face calm and resolute. She walked directly to Cole. "The lawyers have confirmed that my inheritance is secure," she said softly. "William and Thomas will want for nothing. They want me to come back to St. Louis immediately." Cole nodded, a hollow feeling in his chest. "Of course. That's where you belong." "No," she said, her blue eyes locking with his. "I thought so too. But my old life is a ghost. My home was never a mansion in St. Louis. Home is a place where you are safe, where you are loved, where your children are protected." She reached out and touched his good arm. "My home is here, with you, if you'll have us." Cole stared at her, unable to process the words. He, the penniless fool, the town joke. But I have nothing, he stammered. A pile of ash, 10 acres of land I haven't even seen yet. You have everything that matters? Cole Thornton, she said, a small smile gracing her lips. You have courage and honor, and a heart big enough to take in 3 strangers, when you had nothing to give but yourself. I have a fortune, it's true, but you have wealth. And so the heiress from St. Louis stayed. With her resources and Higgins's land, a new house rose from the Montana soil, not a mansion, but a strong, handsome ranch house overlooking the creek. The town watched no longer laughing, but with a sense of communal pride. They had played a part in this story, and it had redeemed them as much as it had redeemed Cole. Cole Thornton, the broke cowboy, became a respected rancher. He married Rosalind Ainsworth in the small town church with the whole of Redemption Gulch in attendance. William and Thomas grew from tiny, wailing infants into strong, healthy boys who toddled through the fields, their laughter echoing in the clean mountain air. Cole never lost the quiet humility that had defined him. But he was no longer a fool. He was a husband, a father, and a living legend. He was the man who, with nothing but his own decency, had faced down death and ridicule, and in saving a family had saved the soul of a town. The story of Cole Thornton and Rosalind Ainsworth is a powerful reminder that true wealth is not measured in gold, but in courage and compassion. It shows how the quietest acts of kindness can echo with the loudest impact, and how a community can be reborn when it stops laughing at a good man and starts listening to his heart. This was a tale forged in the dust and fire of the Wild West, but its lessons are timeless. If this story of redemption, love, and the incredible strength of the human spirit moved you, please honor its memory by giving this video a thumbs up. Share it with others who appreciate tales of true grit and unlikely heroes. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove that even in the harshest of lands, the best parts of our nature can and will endure. Thank you for listening.